Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to this talk. We're here to listen to Helen Frink, who is very knowledgeable about Nathaniel Ransom. And I'm just going to remind everyone, you can save your questions to the end. You can type them in the chat if you'd like while Helen's talking, and I'll go over them at the end. Or if you prefer, when we get to the question part, you can use the raise hand function, which should be down at the bottom somewhere. And I'll unmute you, and you can ask your question. But as I said, we're here to listen to Helen Frink, and Helen is descended from the Mattapoiosett Ransom, Dexter, and Hiller families. She's the author of These Acworth Hills, Alstead Through the Years, and Women After Communism, East German Experience. She retired from Keene State College as Professor Emerita of Modern Languages, and she lives too far from the sea in Acworth, New Hampshire. Since retirement, she works pro bono in conservation and historic preservation. So whenever you're ready, Helen, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I'm happy to see a couple of my cousins here. Always a good moment. As I begin, I have to explain that this is a family story. So on the left is a picture of my grandmother, Laura Ransom Frink, and on the right is a picture of her father, Nathaniel Ransom, my great-grandfather, who is the subject of my book. My grandmother lived with us when I was a child, and she taught all of her grandchildren to read and write. She said nothing at all about her father. All I knew about him was that this photograph of him hung in the parlor. I started out looking for a different great-grandfather, also from Mattapoiosett, by the name of Matthew Hiller, and then by coincidence, I stumbled upon the story of Nathaniel Ransom. The first thing I learned about him was that I read his name in an article in the New York Times from the fall of 1871, naming him, together with other members of the crew of whaling ships that had safely returned from the worst disaster in American whaling history. I was so curious to find that I had an ancestor in the New York Times that I decided I had to pursue his story. And this is what I found out about him. He was born in 1845. His father originally came from the little town of Carver, Massachusetts, and he moved the family to Mattapoiosett in 1855, so when Nathaniel was 10. Nathaniel Ransom's father was a widower with 4 children, all boys, the youngest of whom was just 2 years old when his wife died. Obviously, the poor man had to marry again. He married a widow named Eunice Snow Cushing, whose children had all died in infancy. And together, James Ransom and Eunice Snow Cushing had 3 more boys. So Nathaniel Ransom was the 6th of 7 sons. At the age of 14, he finished public school, and that was all that there was available for free public education in Mattapoiosett at that time. He needed to find work at the tender age of 14, and so he went to sea as a whaleman. Every one of the 7 Ransom brothers went to sea at the age of 14, except for 2 who started their whaling career at the age of 13. Today, none of us would send a child who's 14 or 13 years old away for 3 or 4 years on a whaling voyage, parts unknown, and unable to communicate with the family. This document, this protection paper, was a kind of passport to give him the protection of an American consul in foreign ports. It tells us that he was an American seaman, so not a cabin boy, 14 years old, only 5 feet 1.5 inches tall. He was simply a child when he began his whaling career. Between the years of 1860 and 1875, he made 4 whaling voyages, and he spent a total of 12 years on the ocean. Whaling had almost petered out by the time he began his whaling career in 1860. The peak of sperm whaling, really the 1840s and 1850s. And by the time Nathaniel Ransom came along, it was a totally different sort of game, that is Arctic whaling. And I'll explain the where and the how and the when of that in just a few minutes. Life aboard a whaling vessel was quite miserable. The seamen lived below decks in what the forecastle or foc'sle as they called it, and the common sailors lived there all together in bunks. The area was dark, damp, crowded, and dirty, and the work was hard, and the food was monotonous. Salt pork, salt beef stored in barrels, served up in a kind of gravy, cooked together with potatoes, sometimes onions, and hard bread. The whaling life was so miserable that whalemen jumped ship. No surprise to know they jumped ship in the South Pacific as Herman Melville did, but they also left the ship in the Arctic as well. These whaling vessels were about 100 to 120 feet long. This is the Charles W. Morgan, and I assume many of you people who are interested in whaling were able to see it when it sailed up the East Coast 5 or 6 years ago, as I did. This Charles W. Morgan is a ship that Nathaniel Ransom knew and went on board when the ship was in port in the Hawaiian Islands. The ship is about, as I said, about 120 feet long, and the main mast is about as tall as the ship is long. So I imagine a 14-year-old boy scrambling all the way up the rigging to follow the orders of the mate to furl or unfurl the sails. When the Charles W. Morgan or a whaling ship was under sail, the whale boats would have ordinarily been stored on deck. You can see here the whale boats hanging over the side of the vessel. That would have been the case when the ship was actively pursuing whales. If all of this canvas sail were laid flat on the ground, it would cover about 2/3 of an acre. Nathaniel Ransom's first voyage began in the spring of 1860, and he was aboard a ship called the Barnstable. The Barnstable first set out seeking sperm whales, and sperm whales swim generally in warm waters around both north and south of the equator, but sperm whaling had about played out. The Barnstable traveled toward the Azores. These ships very commonly stopped there to pick up more crew, then headed south along the coast of Brazil. They found only 4 small sperm whales and took them, and those were the only sperm whales whose capture Nathaniel Ransom ever participated in. The Barnstable meandered north, south, east, and west around the Cape of Good Hope, so around the tip of Africa into the Indian Ocean, and he spent his first Christmas in what was called Desolation Ground near the coast of Antarctica, where the crew captured an albatross just for the lack of something to do. The ship continued on its way around New Zealand and Australia, and then finally, the captain decided to head north. By this time, Arctic whaling was some of the most lucrative way to make a living. So the Barnstable followed a route that would be common for Nathaniel Ransom's other whaling voyages and headed northward. This map has a line coming up through the Aleutian Islands, and that line says 72 passage. That's what whalemen called the 172 degrees west latitude and, west longitude. And that was the safest passage up through the Aleutian Islands. The whaling vessels that were after bowhead whales usually had to battle the ice as they traveled north, typically in the months of May and June, and they edged their way along the coast of Siberia. Along the coast of Siberia were tiny whaling settlements, little trading outposts, and the whalemen would kind of creep northward from one to the next and try to make their way through the Bering Strait. The first attempts at bowhead whaling happened after 1848. There was a captain named Thomas Royce who's credited with first making his way through the Bering Strait, obviously a dangerous and treacherous passage that was very little known at that time, and was fortunate enough to find bowhead whales, which were suddenly a new and lucrative hunt for the whalemen. This is the head of a bowhead whale, and it looks huge and also odd. I'm seeing some blue lines on my screen. I'm afraid I don't know where those come from. The bowhead whale was about 70 feet long and weighed about 1 ton per foot. The whale swims in water about 32 degrees, and for that reason, it has blubber as much as 20 inches thick. So more blubber means more insulation. More blubber meant more whale oil, and these whales could produce as much as 3,000 gallons of oil. So a barrel of whale oil is 31.5 gallons, and these large whales could make as much as 100 barrels. That made it a terrifically lucrative catch for the whalemen. You see hanging out of the whale's mouth these very, very odd strips that look like look like a comb. Those are baleen. So these whales swallow krill or plankton. They gulp in seawater and then press the tongue against the whale's mouth. The baleen, these strips, fold backwards into the whale's throat and strain out the krill or plankton that's the whale's chief food. The upper jaw of the whale can contain as much as 500 of these strips of baleen, and they could be as long as 14 or 16 feet. And they became a very lucrative secondary product of capturing a bowhead whale, in addition to the oil. This is my baleen. So this is one of my most prized possessions. It's a strip of baleen that's 8 feet long, and it was given to me by a cousin of my husband when she heard that I was studying bowhead whales. So as you look at this, you have to imagine that baleen is flexible and springy. It's the same stuff as fingernails or horses' hooves. The part of the baleen that you see toward the left is the part that grew out of the whale's jaw, and that's relatively thick, so as thick as a 1/4 inch. And then it tapers and becomes more springy and thinner toward the far end that you see toward the right. The hairs that are hanging down there feel exactly like the hair of horses' hoofs. Baleen could be steamed, split, and then bent into shape to make a host of useful things. On the left, you can see an illustration for umbrellas. The ribs and handles of umbrellas could be made of baleen, and the visors of men's caps, stiffening for men's shirt collars, buggy springs, and a host of other items could be made from baleen. On the right, where it says Iceman's adjustable hip corset, Iceman, because this is baleen from bowhead whales that come from the Arctic, this was the most lucrative and the most long-lasting use of baleen, and that was women's fashion. So the bones in the corset that give the shape to the waist were made of baleen strips that had been split and cut and shaped. If you think back to Civil War days, you can also imagine those huge hoop skirts that women wore, and those were held out from the woman's legs by a series of hoops, and those hoops were also made of baleen. So women's fashion was a lucrative market for baleen, but it also fluctuated and changed over the years when Nathaniel Ransom was whaling. The price of whale oil might be cut in half or double in price in the time that a whaling ship was at sea. It was a gamble. This modern photograph shows cutting in the blubber from a bowhead whale. This is obviously a modern photograph, and it's native people who are entitled to take baleen whales. On the left upper corner, you can see the blades of baleen and these hairy strips. And then, because the whale's head has already been severed, and then the man who is cutting off the baleen, this is very similar to the process that would have been done aboard a whale ship. When bowhead whales were caught at sea, they were chained to the side of the vessel, and then the men cutting off the blubber stood on a rigged system of planks hanging over the side of the ship. That was called the cutting stage. They cut the blubber away from the whale's body in strips like you see here, and then it was peeled off around the circumference of the whale and hauled aboard ship by a block and tackle, and then cut up into smaller pieces. It was a bloody, greasy, smelly, and dangerous business. This is a try-works. This is a photo from the Charles W. Morgan. So this is a brick hearth. And as you look at it, you can see it. That's where the fire was made, first with wood or coal, and then later the fire would be fueled with scraps of whale skin. The blubber was cut up and then pieces put into the tripots. Those are those huge cast iron kettles. I've seen them around Mattapoiosett. Some people still have them. And those could hold as much as 200 or 250 gallons of oil. The blubber had to be heated just below the boiling point in order to bring out the oil. And the oil was then ladled into the cooling tank that you see to the left of the try-works. And then after it had cooled, it was run below decks into casks and barrels in the hold. This was a smoky, dirty business, and whaling vessels were notorious for being dirty and smelly and causing dirty smoke. It was obvious at sea when a vessel was boiling off. These ships sailed after bowhead whales and hunted them successfully throughout the summer months. So generally July and August, if whalemen were lucky, into September. And then the whaling vessels headed back southward out of the Arctic through the Bering Strait and made for the Sandwich Islands, now called Hawaii. In this shot of Honolulu Harbor, you can see the whaling vessels docked here. And these ships commonly stayed in Honolulu or else in Hilo. Hilo's on the eastern side of the Big Island. In the Sandwich Islands in Honolulu, usually from late October through November. It was an opportunity to clean the ships. The whale oil and baleen could be sent home on whatever ships were headed back to New Bedford. And for men like Nathaniel Ransom, this was one of the rare opportunities to get letters from home. It was also a time to restock the ships and hire on new crew members. During the winter months from December, January, February, and March, it obviously wasn't possible to go whaling in the Arctic. So these whaling vessels headed south in search of humpback whales and also before I get, I have to interject. This is a slide that shows baleen being dried. Looks like palm leaves standing up, but baleen being dried in the sand in Honolulu, so in Hawaii, in port. And you can see by the height of the man in the foreground that this baleen is probably a good 14 or 16 feet long. So lucrative, very useful material, and could be dried this way in the sun. In the ships that Nathaniel Ransom served on, it was commonly simply dried on deck, tied into bundles that weighed 100 pounds apiece, and then stored in the hold until it could be taken out in port in the Sandwich Islands and shipped home. As I started to say, the whalemen in the winter months started on what they called their between seasons cruise. And that meant the winter cruise after Pacific gray whales and humpbacks. These Pacific gray whales were about 40 to 50 feet long, the females larger than the males. And they gave birth during the winter months in the lagoons and bays of the coast along California and Mexico. They were of less value than bowhead whales. Their blubber was not as thick and the baleen was much shorter, but they gave the men an opportunity to make some kind of a profit in the period when they were unable to be whaling actively in the Arctic. The Pacific gray whales, like the whalemen, migrated. So they too headed south during the cold months. December, January, February was the high point of whaling in the between seasons cruise. And then in the spring and in the summer months, they headed back north as the whalemen did, back through islands, Bering Strait, and up into the Chukchi Sea north of Alaska. The whalemen then made the same kind of a voyage. The Barnstable also spent the between seasons cruise off the coast of California and Mexico, and then the summer seasons back into the Arctic. Nathaniel Ransom came home from his first voyage in the spring of 1864. He had about a year and a half on land. This is a painting of Mattapoiosett Harbor as it would have looked in 1870. It was during the spring and summer months of 1864 that Nathaniel Ransom was back home here. Remember that 1864 is the Civil War years. Two of his brothers joined the Union Navy, Theodore and Sidney, and worked on steam-powered gunboats in the Gulf of Mexico. It would be another 20 years before steam power made its way into whaling. What we know about Nathaniel Ransom's time on land is first that he went fishing on the Grand Banks. He went cod fishing to earn some pay for a time. He also went to a winter term of school. I envisaged that he always wanted to get more education than those 8 years of public schooling. So he went to school in Middleborough for one term. And then in April of 1865, for some reason, he was at the Siege of Mobile in Alabama. And I haven't been able to find out exactly what he was doing there. In addition to his two brothers in the Union Navy, a third brother, Joseph, served with the Massachusetts Colored Infantry Volunteers. And again, I know relatively little about his military service. The Civil War brought changes to whaling. First of all, about a dozen old whaling vessels that were no longer useful were sunk in the port of Charleston, and about another dozen in the harbor of Savannah. The idea was that these stone fleets, as they were called, should create some sort of a barricade, making it impossible for the Confederacy to use these ports. That proved to not be terribly useful. There were also Confederate raiders, particularly the Alabama and the Shenandoah gunships that preyed on whaling vessels. The Alabama, for example, captured and burned the Altamaha off the coast of Portugal. That's the whaling vessel that my other great-grandfather, Matthew Hiller, was on. The Confederate raider Shenandoah raided whale ships in the North Pacific and continued to destroy them into June of 1865, seemingly unaware that the Civil War had ended by then. During his time on land, Nathaniel Ransom got engaged to a young woman named Sarah Dexter. Sarah Dexter's father was a ship's caulker working in Mattapoiosett, and Sarah, as it turned out, was the only surviving child of 4 children, and her younger sister and 2 brothers had died either in early childhood, or one brother, Philander, lived to be about 12 years old, but Sarah was an only child by the time Nathaniel came calling. They became engaged in 1865 and then spent the next 4 years apart. So in the fall of 1865, Nathaniel Ransom signed on with a ship called the Sea Breeze, and this time he was promoted from seaman to harpooner. You're probably familiar with this statue in New Bedford. I use it to illustrate that the harpooner's task was not to kill the whale, but to pierce him with this harpoon. The whaling journals say that the boat steerer, that's what the harpooner was called, the boat steerer darted his iron. Darted his iron sounds very lightweight and inconsequential. This took considerable strength. After having impaled a whale with the harpooner moved very carefully to the stern of the whaleboat, and he became the boat steerer. The mate or the captain had the prerogative of actually killing the whale with a lance. And the boat steerer's job then was to bring the whaleboat as close as possible to the whale, who was by then, of course, wounded, swimming, thrashing around, and trying his best to escape capture. The Sea Breeze set out from New Bedford and then immediately fell into difficulty. The crew caught typhoid fever from dirty water casks. Typhoid fever meant diarrhea, fever, delirium, vomiting, dysentery. And the ship had so few people able to work the ship that they had to spend 3 months in port. So typically these ships headed southward in the fall. This ship didn't get very far before the typhoid fever epidemic struck. The second mate and the fourth mate of the Sea Breeze died and were buried in Port Stanley, and the captain went ashore and spent time in a hotel to recover. Nathaniel Ransom, whose journal entry is cited on the left, apparently recovered fairly quickly, but he was terribly impatient about getting on whaling ground and actually getting busy. The ship finally made it in early spring to Honolulu, and Nathaniel Ransom and a good friend went fast riding on the beach. So rented horses and went riding. They promptly got arrested for fast riding, clapped in jail for 2 nights and fined 25 cents. From there, the Sea Breeze headed northward, and this time not into the Chukchi Sea, not through the Bering Strait this time, but into the Sea of Okhotsk. So here, whaling had started a few years earlier. And by the time Nathaniel Ransom spent 3 summer seasons whaling there, the Sea of Okhotsk had actually gotten rather crowded with whaling vessels. The bowhead whales here were also slightly smaller than those further north, but nonetheless, he spent 3 fairly lucrative seasons there and returned to Hawaii each fall and spring, and then made that between seasons cruise during the winter months after humpback whales and Pacific gray whales. Nathaniel Ransom actually jumped ship in December of 1868 because he wanted to get home more quickly. And he signed on another vessel called the Navy and made his way finally back to Mattapoiosett in June of 1869. This is a voyage for which I know how much money he actually made. So whalemen were paid in a fractional system by dividing the proceeds from whale oil and baleen. A third of the proceeds of the voyage went to the owners, a third went to the cost of provisioning the ship, and the last third went to the captain and crew, divided according to seniority. As a harpooner, he made a little bit more than he would have made as a seaman, but far less than he would have made as a second or first mate. The money that he had debited from his earnings for materials from the slops chest. The slops chest was kind of company store aboard ship. And there was a high rate of interest that whalemen paid for anything that they bought from the slops chest. He did smoke tobacco during his whole life, and that was a considerable expense here. So this is his pay for 3 years. By comparison, a private in the Union Army earned about $13 a month. So whaling was about the same degree of danger as the Union Army, but it certainly paid better. This was considered for whaling at that time fairly good pay. So he returned in June of 1869, and he married Sarah Dexter. This wedding certificate, very handsome, is something my grandmother treasured and kept in her bedroom. We still have it. They they began married life together. Remember, they had been engaged for 4 years. And during that time, Sarah and Nathaniel wrote letters to each other whenever they could, but those letters took sometimes 4 to 6 months to travel from Mattapoiosett to Hilo or Honolulu to reach him. And then it was the same number of months before he was able to reply to Sarah. This is his entry for the day of his wedding. Notice that regardless of what the events were on a particular day, he began with comments on the weather. That was an unfailing, lifelong habit. Sarah and Nathaniel began married life simply moving in with her parents. So they lived together with Sarah's parents in this house on Pine Island Road that is still in existence. This is the house that Sarah had grown up in. So they spent 4 months together of married life, and then Nathaniel Ransom set out on his 3rd voyage aboard a ship called the John Wells. The John Wells was also an Arctic whaler, so he was back to hunting bowheads, and this time he had been promoted to 3rd mate. As 3rd mate, he had charge of a whaleboat and crew and enjoyed slightly better accommodations aboard ship and slightly better pay than he had as a seaman or as a harpooner. By this time, the new hunt for Arctic whalemen was walrus. The rifles had been improved during the Civil War, and the walrus oil had become easier to refine walrus oil. The walrus drift around on these cakes of ice in approximately the same range as bowhead whales, and they tended not to react to the sound of gunshots, but to the scent of a man. If a shooter could sneak up on them where herds of walrus were lying on these floes of ice, he might be able to shoot several of them before the walrus became aware and rolled or jumped into the sea. Very commonly, more walrus were wounded or slaughtered than the whalemen were able to actually capture. The procedure was for a whaleboat to row or sail out to the ice floes where the herds of walrus were and shoot as many as possible, and then slaughter the walrus where they lay on the ice. So cut off the blubber and cut off their ivory tusks, which were also valuable, and load that into the whaleboat, about the blubber and tusks perhaps of 7 or 8 walrus, and then take that all the way back to the whale ship to cut the blubber up and try it out, and then head back for more walrus slaughter. The summer daylight in the Arctic is obviously just about through the entire night. So this kind of slaughter of walrus, this hunt, went on virtually round the clock. The Civil War had also brought better weapons for hunting the bowhead whales themselves. Now it was possible to shoot with something called a bomb lance gun. And this gun achieved 3 goals at once. The no longer called the harpooner, but the boat steerer, in this case, Nathaniel Ransom, who was 3rd mate and in charge of his own whaleboat, stood in the prow of the whaleboat, as you can see here, and shot. The gun fired a lance that pierced the hide of the bowhead whale and carried a bomb that exploded in the whale's body. At the same time, the lance carried a rope that made fast to the whaleboat. This was far safer and easier than hunting with a harpoon because the man could shoot the rifle far further than he could throw a harpoon. It also, the bomb inside the whale's body also caused a more serious wound and was more likely, at least, to kill the whale. It turned out that Nathaniel Ransom was a crack shot. So during the season of the 1870 summer season, his ship, the John Wells, took 11 bowheads and he shot and killed 4 of them. It was a fairly successful season, and at the end of it, the ship headed south together with the rest of the Northern Whaling Fleet in October of 1870. In October 9th and 10th of that year, a fierce storm struck the North Pacific Whaling Fleet as they were trying to make their way through the Bering Strait. Several of the ships were terribly damaged. One ship was lost. A ship called the Japan apparently had gotten lost, wrecked, sunk. No one was quite sure. The rest of the whaling fleet made it back south into warmer waters. This time, Nathaniel Ransom's ship did not dock in Hawaii as usual. In search of humpback whales and in hopes of capturing a few more sperm whales. So they came through Micronesia through these South Sea islands, particularly around Palau. So you can see Palau toward the left-hand side of your screen. They also travel through or among several of these other small islands. You can see the island nation of Kiribati there, and then further down in this map and a little bit closer to Australia, you see Vanuatu. Kiribati and Vanuatu are island nations that are now in danger of disappearing due to sea level rise. And we know that Tonga just experienced a terrible, destructive tsunami. So these are the small islands where Nathaniel Ransom's ship traveled. Very little success hunting humpbacks or sperm whales here. This was a completely unprofitable between seasons cruise. What is significant is that the ship, because it was not docking in the Hawaiian Islands, had very little opportunity to restock with provisions such as salt pork, salt beef, potatoes, and the staples of mealtime aboard a whaling vessel. Nathaniel Ransom visited what was then called Ascension Island. Today, this island is called P-O-A-E-I. And what I found out here was that he sold his accordion to the king of this island, King Nanigan, he was called. I had no idea that Nathaniel Ransom played the accordion, so this was new information to me. King Nanigan appears in other whaling journals. He was a native leader of this island, and he liked to wear a stovepipe hat and a man's white shirt, and apparently nothing else. Nathaniel Ransom also bought a parrot here and some shells that he intended to take back to Sarah. The ship returned to the Arctic in early early summer of 1871, but was surprised to meet a canoe full of men who appeared emaciated, wearing furs, bearded, filthy. The whalemen first assumed that these were native Chukchi people from Siberia. It turned out instead that this was the captain, Captain Frederick Barker, and part of his crew from the ship Japan. So we think our way back to the October storm that struck in 1870, and that had wrecked Captain Barker's ship on the coast of Siberia. Captain Barker described being taken in eventually by the Chukchi people, and the Chukchis had nothing to eat except whale blubber, some of it already putrid, some of it still attached to the hide of the walrus, and with the hair of the walrus hide still on it. Captain Barker had nothing else to eat, and he said it was 3 days before he could bear to taste walrus blubber. He realized that this was all the Chukchi people had to eat, and he traveled among the whaling fleet in 1871 and urged them to stop slaughtering walrus. That did no good whatsoever. Nathaniel Ransom's ship continued to slaughter walrus, as did the rest of the whaling fleet. The crew of Captain Barker's vessel, by the way, were distributed among the other ships in the whaling fleet and went to work as best they could to try to earn their way back home to warmer waters. Nathaniel Ransom learned in 1871, in May or in June, that his youngest brother, Andrew, was not far away. He had signed on as harpooner of a ship called Progress. Andrew had followed Nathaniel Ransom, followed all of his older brothers into the whaling trade. He was about 20 by this time, and he was on his third voyage. It turned out that he was sick aboard the Progress, and the captain had put him below decks again. Nathaniel took his brother some fur-lined boots and some mittens that he'd bought from the native people, and Andrew had brought him letters from their parents, and several Nathaniel wrote from his darling wife. It's worth noting that the way that Nathaniel was able to visit his brother was simply to walk across the ice. The Progress, together with 6 other whaling ships, were trapped in the ice off the coast of Alaska, and men could simply walk from one whaling vessel to another across the cakes of ice. The Progress and these 6 other ships remained further to the south because they were trapped there, while the other 33 ships in the Northern Fleet traveled further north, among them the John Wells, Nathaniel Ransom's ship. It soon turned out, however, that this was not the advantage in hunting bowheads that they had imagined. The John Wells, Nathaniel Ransom ship, took pride in being head of navigation, as it was called, that is further north than anybody else. But the ice conditions were already very bad. The first ship to be crushed was a ship called Roman on September 1st, and it sank in 48 minutes. This was not a disaster for the men aboard. They simply clambered out of the ship onto the ice floes and were quickly taken aboard any nearby vessels. But the next day, September 2nd, another ship called the Comet ran aground. In 2015, NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, traveled to the area of these shipwrecks to find out if they could see any remains and to discover exactly where these ships had run aground or been trapped in the ice. And this sort of curved rectangle that you see outlined in blue shows where these ships were. And the inset shows you on the map of Alaska exactly where this part is located. So today these ships are about 100 feet offshore, and they're in the wreckage, that is what's left of them, which is in fact just a few iron items. Very little is actually left, but is in water about 8 to 13 feet deep. These ships then were trapped there. There were originally 33 of them. 2 of them had been crushed, and in the next few days, another 3 ships were crushed in the ice. The ice pushed the ships, drove them right into the coast of Alaska, where the water was fairly shallow. So the ice flows, using off the coast of Antarctica, or the iceberg that hit the Titanic. These are floes of ice, so relatively flat cakes of ice that the wind drove up and piled atop one another and then shoved into these ships. The illustrations that you see in the next couple of slides were done by a Captain Edward Kelly, who was aboard one of the vessels that was wrecked. So these were things that he sketched from his own personal experience. It became impossible then for the ships to move. The captains met together in the cabin of one of the ships, and these captains tried to decide first what they could do to rescue them. There was to load everything in a couple of the smaller vessels and try to get them afloat and see if they could be used as rescue vessels. These 2 ships that were refloated immediately ran aground again, and they had to give up on that attempt. They did note that 7 whaling vessels, Andrew Ransom's ship, the Progress, and 6 others, were about 70 miles further south along the coast of Alaska. And so they sent a small group of 3 whaleboats under a Captain Fraser southward to find out if these 7 whaling vessels would agree to wait for them so that the crew and captains of these trapped whaling ships could be taken aboard those that were in warmer waters further to the south and relatively safe. So Nathaniel Ransom and his crew members lay about 70 miles from these 7 ships that were far to the south. Nathaniel Ransom's journal entry is shown here on the left. And when he talks about what a fix we are in, and leave us here to winter, he was thinking very clearly of Captain Frederick Barker, and he knew exactly what there was for food stores aboard the John Wells. It was part of his work to bring food supplies back up from the hold so that they could be cooked for meals. And he knew there was very little left by way of provisions aboard ship. He remembered Captain Frederick Barker talking about taking refuge among the Chukchi people and trying to survive on walrus blubber. Barker had also described the fearful isolation, the inability to communicate with the Chukchi people by any sort of language, and just the terrible isolation and the brutal Arctic winter. All of that was in the mind of the men who were trapped in these 33 whale ships to the north. Captain Dowden, whose words are cited on the right, these words are given verbatim in every account of this whaling disaster. He said, "Tell them all I will wait for them as long as I have an anchor left or a spar to carry a sail." By chance, this is the captain of the ship that Nathaniel's brother Andrew Ransom was on. So Nathaniel Ransom then was among the people who had to outfit his whaleboat to carry as much as possible of provisions and people southward to these ships. Nathaniel and his whaleboat crew made this journey 70 miles to the south, rowing and sailing twice. They made it the first time in order to carry all the provisions and belongings that they could to these 7 rescue ships, sailed and rowed their way back northward to the trapped ships, and then set out immediately once again, carrying as many people as each whaleboat could carry. Now, there were 1,219 people aboard the whaling ships that were trapped. There were a few of those were women and children. Occasionally, a captain would bring his wife along and children aboard. Every person there was saved and made his or her way safely to these rescue ships. But you can see in this illustration that was drawn by Captain Kelly that the weather was terrible. The seas were rough. It was extremely windy. It was all the rescue ships could do to hold their position. Nevertheless, everyone got ashore safely. And then these 7 rescue ships made their way southward, first along the coast of Siberia, where they needed to stop in order to take on fresh water and some provisions, and then finally into Hawaii. There, at last, Nathaniel Ransom reached port in Honolulu, and he describes here receiving letters from his parents, from his brothers Theodore and James, and 5, he says, from my darling wife. Then he mentions going aboard the Progress to see Andrew for a bit. And Nathaniel Ransom, by the way, had put all of his belongings aboard one of the 7 rescue ships called Lagoda. He would have liked to be aboard the Progress with his brother. He ended up on a ship called Europa, and there were 300 people on board the Europa, which ordinarily would have carried about 24 to 30 people. So these rescue ships were extremely crowded. Notice that Nathaniel Ransom comments that he had to quit reading his letters before he finished them on account of not feeling able to proceed any further. I have felt very bad all day. He was a person who experienced emotional turmoil or disaster as physical illness. And in the days before we knew anything about PTSD, this brush with near death was one of the things that affected him physically. He spent a little time in Honolulu, and then he traveled to San Francisco by steamer, and then from San Francisco to Oakland, and took the train back to his family. The train traveled across country. Remember that the Transcontinental Railroad was only 2 years old at this time. So this was the first experience that he had traveling by train such a great distance. One of the experiences that he had as he made this train journey was to pass through the city of Chicago, where he saw the ruins of the Great Chicago Fire that had happened about a month earlier. It's interesting that he must have compared his fate with the people in Chicago. There, about 100 homes had been destroyed and several hundred people had been left homeless. At least as far as Nathaniel Ransom knew, his own family in Mattapoiosett was safe and intact. So he proceeded back. He reached Mattapoiosett in November of 1871 safely at last, and he remained on land for the next 3 years. This is the longest time that he stayed on land. He and Sarah lived in a little house on Foster Street, not far from the waterfront in Mattapoiosett. And Sarah gave birth to 2 daughters, Laura, my grandmother, and a second daughter who was named Eunice after Nathaniel's mother. In 1873, an economic depression struck the United States caused by overspeculation in railroads, and economic conditions became very hard. The whaling fleet had shrunk in these years as well, from about 40 ships to just about 16. But in 1875, early in the year, he decided that the only way that he could earn enough money for his young family was to go back to whaling. That's what he decided to do. By now, most whaling ships docked in San Francisco. Because railroad travel now across the continental United States, whaling vessels no longer had to make their way around Cape Horn. Instead, he traveled by train, once again across country. It took about 8 days at that time. And he took the train to Oakland and then streetcars to San Francisco, where the ship was docked. He visited with Andrew once again. Andrew was by then working on merchant ships. And he met the captain who had been the captain of the John Wells, of the ship of the whaling disaster, and other people that he knew. Then he set sail on this ship called the Illinois. The captain was David Fraser, who had taken those 3 whale boats first south to the whaling ships that were eventually the rescue ships. And this voyage on the Illinois turned out to be fairly successful in monetary terms. It was noteworthy to read that Nathaniel Ransom returned to the scene of the wrecked ships in 1871, and he returned there to gather firewood. So the ships by then had broken up. The native people had taken whatever they could carry from the whaling vessels, including any kind of metal tools and things like rope and so forth. There was some wreckage left, some timbers that could be used for firewood. Notice that the walrus slaughter continues, and the whaling voyage turned out to be very successful. He made more money and took more blubber and baleen in this one summer season in the Arctic than on any of his other voyages that lasted 3 years, for example. So this was a huge gain from a single year of whaling. It was enough for Nathaniel Ransom to return to Mattapoiosett and never return to whaling at all. Instead, he bought a slightly larger house not far from Father Dexter, and he and Sarah moved in here. This little sketch was made by his youngest son, my Uncle Everett. This house is still standing on the Marion Road. It doesn't look much like this anymore. Nathaniel Ransom earned a modest living. He was a good carpenter. He raised vegetables for the summer trade. He took people back and forth to places like Tabor Academy in his buggy. And he and Sarah lived here contentedly with their 4 children. He died in 1907 at the age of 61. He never grew very tall. In adulthood, he was only about 5 feet 7 inches high. And I think that he died at 61 in part because he suffered from the miserable conditions aboard ship and the years of hard labor in whaling. Today, we know a little bit more about bowhead whales. One of the things we've learned is how long they live, that they can live perhaps 130 years. It's probably longer than that. A whale that had been harpooned was probably at least 20 years old. So bowhead whales live a very, very long time. This is the remnants that can still be seen underwater from this NOAA expedition to find the wreckage of the whaling vessels from 1871. We see here a small anchor and a few other pieces of metal. This obviously is photography underwater, and there are places where a very few large timbers of those ships apparently remain on the ocean bottom, but very little else. This is a bowhead skeleton, and this is where I'm going to leave my talk and stop screen and see if I can answer some questions. So Jeffrey, perhaps how do we want to proceed? You want to unmute people so that they can ask questions, or do you want to read questions from the chat?
Yeah, why don't we start with questions from the chat?
Good.
There's a couple that came in while you were talking. Let's see. John Doe has asked about the comment in his journal that was that said enough to try the patience of a Jew. And I believe Bob further down did some Googling and found that the Talmudic teachings address patience being a premium virtue.
I don't have any comment on that except to say that Nathaniel Ransom was incredibly patient and he was very persistent. He was one of the people who stayed with the work from beginning to end. On board his second voyage, the Sea Breeze, in addition to the people who died in the Falkland Islands, other people were killed aboard ship. He didn't jump ship. He didn't give up. He stayed with whaling, and with that incredibly hard work throughout his lifetime. So I do think he was incredibly patient and hardworking. The other thing I think about him is he had a huge ability to get along with everybody. And there were times when he worked under a captain who was brutal and unfair, and he stuck it out nevertheless. So that's what I've read into his character, at least.
And we have a couple questions from Jean. She says, did Ransom always leave out of New Bedford?
Yes, for these whaling voyages, except for the last one when he set sail from San Francisco. So in the by the 1870s, because of the Continental Railroad, that really changed whaling, and it was far more efficient to have ships dock in California and send the whalemen cross country than it was for ships and crew to have to travel from New Bedford around Cape Horn, which was always a very difficult passage. So his first 3 voyages left out of New Bedford, and then the last one from San Francisco.
And then Jean's also asking if you know if any of the ships he sailed were made in Mattapoiosett.
I don't think any of these were. There is fantastic information that you can get about these whaling vessels, where they were built, where they traveled, and when. So now, if you're interested in whaling research, you start at the website called whalinghistory.org. And some of the information there is the American offshore whaling voyages, and also the whalemen's shipping list and merchants transcript. Those are just enormous database of information, and they do tell where whaling ships were built. The other good resource in print is Starbuck's History of the American Whale Fishery. And with these 3 sources, you can really find out anything.
Yep. All right, what else? Let's see. Wayne Braley is asking if you happen to know the names of Nathaniel Ransom's parents.
Yes, Eunice Cushing, Eunice Snow Cushing. Cushing was her married name, so her original name was Eunice Snow. Her husband Cushing had died, and then she married Nathaniel's father, whose name was James Ransom. Yes. These people, Nathaniel and Sarah Dexter and most of the rest of the family is buried in the Pine Island Cemetery in Mattapoiosett, not far from where Nathaniel Ransom lived.
All right, and let's see. Then we have a question from the Wanderer. I assume that's Mary Lou. Would you repeat how you came to write this book?
I was looking for the story of Matthew Hiller, Captain Matthew Hiller, who's my other great grandfather that I knew a few things about. And I started researching whaling history, and I read Lands of Sipican. And in there's a brief description of this whaling disaster of 1871. My grandmother had also told me a story about one of her ancestors being frozen in the ice in wintertime. That turned out to be a disaster that happened, I think, I'm trying to remember, I think it might have been in Mattapoiosett. There was a ship called Betsy that came into port and was trapped in the ice, and men went out to try to save it, two of whom were ancestors of Ephraim Dexter, Sarah Dexter's father. So I connected my grandmother's story and the history of Matthew Hiller, my other great grandfather, and stumbled upon this whaling disaster, and then found Nathaniel Ransom's name in the New York Times of all places. And that set me on the journey.
Jeff Watkins has asked how common it was for 14-year-olds to join a whaling ship.
It was very common. So Jeff Watkins, hello. You are my unmet, I think second cousin once removed is about right. I'm not quite sure about that, but Jeff is also a descendant of Nathaniel Ransom. It was incredibly common for people to go to sea at 14 or 13. So Matthew Hiller did. And what was interesting about him, I was always told he was a cabin boy. And that seemed to be, you seem to think of a cabin boy as sort of a waiter at table or a relatively childlike job, you know, a boy. And so I was surprised to learn that Nathaniel Ransom began as a seaman. Two of his brothers started at the age of 13 as cabin boys, but the other five Ransom brothers at 14, all as seamen. So incredibly common. I think for one thing, it took incredible agility, and whaling was a young men's game. I mean, people didn't persist in whaling. Nathaniel Ransom's last whaling voyage that he took, he was only 30. So people had to be young to do it because the labor was incredibly hard, I think. So start young and hope to finish by the age of 30 or so, unless you became an officer and earned more money and so forth.
All right, I've allowed everyone to unmute themselves. If anyone else has a question they'd like to ask, go ahead and unmute yourself. I know Jen is wondering how many people are relatives of Nathaniel. It seems like there's a few here.
Yes. How many people? I'd say probably not more than let's see. I'm one of 4 from that family. What if you consider our children and grandchildren, we multiply maybe 50 or so, I guess. Yeah. We'd have to count.
Does anyone else have any questions? Anyone want to speak up?
No, thank you. And it's nice to meet you. So, Nathaniel was my great-great-grandfather.
Is that right? So
Yes.
you're of the generation below. My email, by the way, is hfrink, HFRINK @keene.edu. Keene is a town in New Hampshire where there's a Keene State College where I taught for years. So
Yes.
hfrink @keene.edu, in case you want to get in touch by email. I'd be
love to.
glad to give a little bit more information.
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you.
Good.
Any other questions? All right, well, I have a quick one. In your talk, you mentioned that he got, I don't remember if you said arrested or cited or something for fast riding. And I was just curious if you could, what exactly is fast riding?
Well, he was in the Sandwich Islands, so in Hawaii at the same time as Mark Twain. And Mark Twain wrote letters about from his travels. And he actually wrote a small book of letters about Hawaii. And there he describes native girls wearing nothing but a kind of scarf that fluttered out behind them as they rode on the beach. And I suspect that was the attraction. So I suspect that was the fast riding part. And as I mentioned, that's how he got in jail.
All right. Well, thank you, Helen. That was fascinating. It was fascinating to hear about his life. It was almost you know, the stuff he saw was just incredible. It's fascinating that he went and saw the remnants of the Great Chicago Fire. Like,
It's whaling history connects you to everything else. There's a little bit of
Yeah.
the Civil War in there, and the discovery of oil. And one of the things that curtailed the market for baleen was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1872 that closed off the European market. So once you delve into whaling history, you're right in the middle of history all around. And it is fascinating. I just love doing this talk, but Jeff, I'm so grateful to the Mattapoiosett Museum for being willing to host it. And
well, thank you.
enjoy it. So thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for wonderful talk. And yeah, I think we'll wrap it up here. If anyone else, keep an eye on our website, keep an eye on our social media for more talks and stuff. We've got stuff in the works. So keep in touch. And again, thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Jeff. Very good. Good night, everyone.
And good night, everyone.
Good night.